Kia ora and welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival podcast, the place where you can hear writers talk about their work, their lives and the inspiration behind their writing. I'm Sonia from the committee behind the festival, and today I'm thrilled to be introducing the wonderful Sue Orr in conversation with Tessa Nicholson. Sue's latest novel, Loop Tracks, tackles abortion, addiction, ageing, autism and euthanasia against a setting of Wellington's first COVID-19 lockdown. They are big topics, tackled with sensitivity, elegance and humour in a work shortlisted for the 2022 New Zealand Ockham Awards. The 2023 Marlborough Book Festival is being held from July 21 to July 23, and author details will be available soon. For now, please enjoy Sue Orr speaking to Tessa Nicholson.
And I'd really like to introduce from Wellington Sue Orr, the author of the book Loop Tracks. Now, Loop Tracks is a fictional novel that opens in Auckland in 1978 with 16-year-old Charlie, who finds herself pregnant. She can't understand how because it's on her first time of having sex, but she has turned out to be pregnant, and she's on a flight to Australia to have an abortion. And Sue, you'd like to do a reading now that will sort of set the mood for how the book starts.
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Tessa, for your introduction. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the first couple of pages to give you a sense of Charlie as a 16-year-old. The first time I got on an aeroplane, I was 16 years old and pregnant. I was on my way to Sydney to have my situation sorted out. It was May 1978, and that's what you had to do if you had enough money for the flight and the procedure. Although they didn't say procedure or termination, not as I recall, they definitely hardly ever said abortion. If you ever were going to find yourself in a situation, 1978 was the absolute worst time for it. A year earlier, we had our own clinic right here in Auckland. A year earlier, there would have been no applying for foreign currency and waiting days for it to come through to your local bank, all the while becoming anxiously more pregnant. When the Australian dollars did finally arrive, ordered especially for you from the Reserve Bank in Wellington, there would have been no need to skulk around in High Street, waiting for the least busy of business hours before sidling up to the bank counter, signing for them under the beady eye of the teller, inevitably the mother of a person in your class at school. Family holiday, or is it just you going to Australia? Looking at you over the top of her glasses like she knew all the facts. Sydney? When, in fact, no one knew all the facts. Not the teller, not the Reserve Bank, not even you. Especially not you. An equally fortuitous time would have been in late 1979 when the Auckland Medical Aid Centre reopened. That ideally would have been the sensible time to become pregnant in the back of a red Vauxhall Victor to a boy you'd notionally fallen in love with. The only significant barrier by late 1979 would have been a wall of rabid protesters screaming your murderous credentials at you as you hung your head low and fought your way through them into the clinic. So you started developing a cold on the Monday before the flight, loud sneezing and coughing and the like, and by Wednesday you'd be secretly rubbing your eyes, making them red, making them run in unison with your nose. Although the nose wasn't running, that part was an illusion. By Thursday, no one was surprised when you didn't turn up at school. Everyone knew you'd been coming down with something, though not a baby. It occurred to no one that you might be coming down with one of those. On Friday, when it was universally assumed you were tucked up in bed with a temperature, you were on an early morning Pan Am flight to Sydney from Auckland Airport. You'd be sorted out by that evening and back at school on Monday, still feeling not 100%, thanks, but a lot better, coming right.
So what happened in 1978? I mean, this is true. This is a true situation in New Zealand. That if Charlie had been pregnant, she couldn't have had an abortion in New Zealand. Why was that?
She couldn't have had a legal abortion in New Zealand. So the history around that period was in the period 18 months in 78 and the first half of 79, political forces, church groups managed to create enough protest and enough resistance to a legal abortion in New Zealand that the only clinic shut down. And so this is a period in which a organisation called Sisters Overseas Services established itself in order to get. It was an underground network, really, right throughout the country, a network of GPs and assisting mostly women would get women needing an abortion across to Australia. And so it was all managed kind of very, very much on the down low. And there were 2 flights, as I understand it, 2 flights a week were going Tuesday mornings and Friday mornings. And women would go across, stay, and then come back again. And, you know, they'd only been away for a weekend somewhere.
So the sisters, that was Dame Margaret Sparrow?
That's right. She was the key person to establish that. And it burst into action almost immediately once that clinic shut down. Yes.
I mean, they did all the organising. They arranged for the women or girls to be picked up at the airport, to be taken on the flights. They didn't give them money. No, but they helped them.
They got the tickets for them, and they arranged. So they had key people. My research has mainly been around the Pan Am flights because that's the focus of this book. But so they had key people on the counters in the airports that knew why these women were travelling, and they had them seated together. They had them down the back of the plane near the bathrooms because they were all in the very early stages of pregnancy, needing the bathroom. And they had people pick up at the other end. They had airline people at the other end to make sure the woman got through. And then the whole process was reversed for the trip home.
So in Loop Tracks, the plane that Charlie is on is a Pan Am flight, and it actually gets delayed for a huge number of hours on the tarmac. That actually happened?
That happened. So the genesis of this book is a friend of mine who was on the plane going to Sydney for this reason. She did not get off. She stayed on the plane. But she shared her story with me, you know, and as a writer, you know, I already knew about the flights. I had friends who had, when I was a teenager, who had to go to Sydney, but she told me her story, and she said, and the flight was delayed for 6 hours, and the writer in me just, you know, the hair went up on the back of my neck, and I was like, here's my story, because 6 hours for a young girl sitting on a plane. And at some point, the option is if anyone on this plane, because it's a full commercial flight, it's, you know, everybody else on the plane is just travelling for normal reasons.
And they're being offered egg sandwiches and drinks. And of course, the air hostesses know that the 3 in the back row are about to have an operation.
So
as
they're
soon
not,
as they arrive.
Yeah.
So they're sort of like, you know you're not allowed to eat, don't you? So they can't have any of the food that's offered.
Yeah, yeah. So there was that classic moment as a writer where I thought, what if the option came up at some point, you can get off this flight if you want and travel another day. And, you know, there's the beginning of the story for me.
But your friend didn't get off?
No, she didn't, no.
And so she went. So Charlie gets off the plane, and then, you know, much to the disgust of her parents, who had already scraped and, you know, saved money, gone to a loan shark, she actually wonders how on earth her parents are ever going to be able to pay back the loan shark who lent them the money for their daughter to have an abortion. And there's sort of this quiet disgust that she hasn't gone through with it. Her parents have still got the expense, but they've also still got the baby to worry about. And she ends up doing, as a lot of women have done, or young girls have ended up doing, being sent to an elderly relative, in Napier in this case, to have the baby, where it's an old auntie of her father's, and she's told in no uncertain terms not to stand in front of the window in case anybody walking past sees her body, and not to go into the backyard where her neighbours can see her, and certainly not to go to the letterbox. In other words, she's to isolate. I mean, that must have been true of so many. You know, the abortion would have been an easy option compared to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably that was one of those 2 options for most schoolgirls. Found them, and then, you know, much in the same way, come back, resume your normal life, and pretend it didn't happen.
I think the most horrifying thing for me was the description of when she actually goes into labour and she has the baby, and she has to deliver him on her side to ensure that she has no sight of him before he's taken away for an adoption. So she's sideways, so she can't see him even as she delivers him. That was just made me cringe. How it seemed so incredibly cruel. So from 1978 we leap forward to 2020, and we're in the year of COVID.
Yeah.
Now, you said in an interview with Kim Hill that writing for you is not about the destination, it's always about the journey. And you obviously couldn't have foretold that COVID would come up and that you could put Charlie as an elderly woman in a situation where COVID was. But we are in 2020. She is a junior school teacher, and she's looking after her grandson Tommy, whom we don't know where Tommy's come from at this stage. But it is the COVID year. So I take it you actually wrote this during 2020, the finish?
Yes, I did. So, like everybody in this room, no one saw COVID coming. And my plan was, at that point, I had written probably a first third of the novel, and I had planned to write the remainder of it playing out against the lead up to the 2020 general election. And I was excited by this idea because I'd established Tommy, who's on a spectrum and is very worked up about the politics of the day. So he's a great fan of Jacinda. He's trying to get his head around the euthanasia and the cannabis referendums that were happening that year. And my plan was to finish the novel playing out my characters' lives against this landscape that I saw rolling out between March and the end of 2020. And
you were throwing a real curveball.
I was throwing a real curveball. So I put the proposal that's how I was going to finish the novel to my publisher, Fergus Barrowman. And he said, yeah, that sounds great, go for it. And, I think we had that discussion on the 20th of February and a month later we were in a lockdown. A thing called a lockdown.
Yeah.
And so it had... as a writer, firstly, as a human being, I wasn't allowed out the front door unless I was going for a walk or to the supermarket. So I had no excuses but to get on with writing this book. So that was a good thing.
Yeah, real bonus.
Yeah, real bonus, no distractions. But then I thought, well, what do I do? How do you write a novel set in 2020 and pretend that COVID's not happening? So I thought, well, I'm just going to play out these lives against COVID. So it was very exciting because I don't know if you remember, but in those early days, every day at 1 o'clock, we got a few more rush to the TV, the numbers, but also in those early days, the instructions on how we would live our lives for the next foreseeable future.
We used to have a sweepstake with our family on a family sort of thing. What are the numbers going to be today?
Yeah.
And we sort of were adding points to, like how many will it be today and how many deaths kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it was every day.
Yeah.
And the messages going back and forth. It was actually a way of keeping together.
Yeah.
Or keeping some sort of family normality.
That's right. I mean, in my lifetime, I don't think I've ever lived through a stranger period,
No, I don't think anybody
and it was
has.
moving so quickly. Anyway, so I was writing in the mornings, and I was writing in real time. So what I was writing on the page was the situation today, and for my characters who already had their complicated lives established when COVID hit, just like all of us had complicated lives going on. Life continued, and we all had to adjust. So they had to adjust with their particular challenges they were going through, and they were going through some big ones by this stage of the book.
You've mentioned about Tommy, now that Tommy has some issues, and I quote, "Tommy likes his loops intact, connected, sturdy and infinite construct." And you've said he was on the spectrum. It's very, very easy to pick up he's on the spectrum, but you never say exactly what is Tommy's issue. Was there a reason for that?
I think, I modelled Tommy on a couple of young men that I know that are on a spectrum, Asperger's, who are, completely functioning in life and joyful people, but they look at life very clearly, black and white. What are the rules? I want rules, the finite loops. And so, in some ways, this new world we were living in where the rules were so strict, what you can and cannot do, perfect for Tommy. We're allowed to do this, but we're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do that,
And no surprises.
No surprises. And, so your question was what exactly it was. Tommy goes to university and he's brilliant at the things he does because
geometry and calculus.
The maths. He's a maths freak. He loves maths, which is, a character that I could never understand as a person. So I actually had to consult a PhD in a woman who has a PhD in geometry to make sure I wasn't making a complete fool of myself with the maths in the book. But, that's Tommy's world.
You did actually write it and give a copy or a draft to a friend of yours whose son you had modelled on.
Yeah.
And what did she tell you?
Well, she told me that I'd been too kind in the first draft. She said, you've captured probably 75% of his personality. She said, but what's missing from here is the anger, the raging anger and she's talking about her son, that he felt when the world didn't conform to the rules as he understood them, and the fact that anger would be taken out on those closest to him, which for my friend was her, and a cruel rages. And so she said, you go back and you put those in the book too.
And what did she say at the final draft?
Oh, she said yes. Now we've got him. We've got him. Yeah.
So there you are, sitting at home, writing in COVID. What was your process on a daily basis, apart from the 1 o'clock news?
Right. My good writing time's in the morning, so I'd get up and write. I kind of write for 2 or 3 hours without any distractions, and then because we were in the weird world of 1 o'clock, change, I would stop then and I would see what the new rules are, and I very rarely write in the afternoon, but perhaps in the evening go back and start where I want to be the following morning.
With those rules?
Yeah, with the new rules, yeah.
So basically the government was giving you the plot for your book.
Yes, and I am grateful for that.
I hope that you did vote for Jacinda after having given you all those details.
Yeah.
As a reader, I found it almost surreal, the COVID aspect, reading about something that, as you have said, was like no other experience any of us have lived through, And did you at any stage, or did Fergus at any stage say, "Oh, I'm not sure if it's too early"?
Yes, and it was on my mind. But firstly, at a practical level, I'm halfway through a novel that's set in 2020. I don't think you could write a 2020 novel and not reference COVID, because it's not just New Zealand, it's global. So you couldn't even do I think I might base this in Australia, because, you couldn't take your story anywhere else. It had to incorporate COVID. But what I focused on in terms of thinking about, is it too early to write about COVID, I thought, everyone in this book had big dramas going on in their lives, and I hope that the reader is up and running with those dramas and engaged in the characters before COVID came along. So what happens to them during COVID is what happened to us during COVID. And COVID, although it's utterly present, it really just provided a landscape on which all the existing dramas could continue to be played out.
I know one reviewer of the book made a comment about when Charlie ends up sleeping with the next door neighbour, David Briscoe, because they'd been sharing a cigarette through the fence, and the reviewer said, "Oh, that's ridiculous, that would never have happened during COVID." Well, actually, I'm sure it did, because I know I got very close to our neighbours, not to the having an affair situation, but certainly sharing a drink over the fence.
Yeah.
That became quite standard for us.
Yeah. Well, it provided an opportunity for characters to behave oddly. Yeah. And also to misbehave. So, we may have had our rules about where we could go and what we could do, but not everyone obeyed them. No. And my characters were amongst those that didn't. Yeah.
But as you say, it was the perfect environment for someone like Tommy. Your friend who fed you the information, that gave you the seed for this book, how did she get on in life? She got past her experience. She's married with 2 lovely sons who are very good friends of my children.
She's had a great life, and I was very negotiating with her the telling of the story. This book would never have been written without her permission and her blessing, and she's been on board. She's been on board from start to finish. Yeah.
When we were talking earlier, you were telling me that since you've written the book and people have interviewed you, whether it's Kim Hill or in a situation like this, you've had people come to you that were actually on that flight.
Yes, I've had 2 others. So I created a fictional 3 characters, but those flights would take up to 30 women each time.
Wow.
And so the reality of the flight, which was a real flight, there were a lot more than my 3 characters. And I've had 2 other women stay behind at events like this and stayed, and I could see they were waiting to talk to me, but not with anybody else around. And they came and they said, yes, I was on that flight, because they remember the delay. Yeah,
wow,
which is incredible.
Yeah,
and in fact, one of them, and obviously nobody will ever know the identities of these people, but one of them knows my friend. And they will never know that about each other, but I know that they were both on the same flight. So.
How does it make you feel when they come up to you and say that? I mean, you actually had touching a real true chord. Well,
we've had tears. We've had lots of tears actually, and I have felt a burden of am I triggering things for people, which obviously this can be a triggering book, and but they have said that they're actually really pleased that somebody's written about that period of New Zealand history, and the personal fallout from the decisions that had to be made during that 18 months.
Having read it, I think it's absolutely right for being made into a television drama.
Oh, thank you.
Do you? Would you say yes if somebody came to you?
No, I think I would.
Because I think that the story of that 78 period is needs to be told, but also that the COVID period is going to turn out to be dramatised at some stage.
Yeah.
So you're also you teach creative writing.
Yeah.
You were a journalist before you went into that. As I think my husband would say, well, isn't journalism more creative writing? But
that's what my news editor said to me once too. What is this?
You teach creative writing.
Yeah.
I'm always intrigued by that. What does it actually mean, creative writing?
Well, that's a good question. I teach fiction, so I teach short fiction. I teach an undergrad class at Victoria University in short fiction, short stories, of course novels, but creative writing can encompass a lot of different genres. So I thought one of the most exciting areas of creative writing, I think, especially in New Zealand at the moment, is creative non-fiction, which essays, personal essays, memoir, just really a fabulous hybrid almost of fact and imagination. And we have some fabulous creative non-fiction writers here in New Zealand. Ashley Young, I could list dozens probably. But
how did you get on? Did you have to do Zoom lessons during COVID with your classes?
I was fortunate in that my classes have all hit these windows where we've been able to teach in person.
You just couldn't see their faces?
No, behind masks. I was telling Tessa before that I saw the full faces of my last cohort of students at our gathering at the end of term, when we met to eat and drink and share our work for the final time, and I actually saw what my students looked like. And so, it's really tricky teaching in a room where you only see the eyes and you crack a joke and you can't tell if they're going, or they're laughing, or, it's very discombobulating. Yeah.
We were just talking about how we don't recognise people in the supermarket with masks on, and you feel very rude.
Yes, you do.
My guest this evening, Steve Brawney, is one of New Zealand's best-known journalists and authors. Steve, welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival 2022.
As an author, I'm very lucky in being sort of sent around the country to literary festivals like this. And I kid you not, by the way, Blenheim, and I think I've been to everyone except the one in Blackball, But of all of them, I've been here twice before, and this is the best. This is actually the best. Yeah, no, thank you. It's just the vibe of it. It's really great. It's really welcoming and friendly. I had an interesting comment on it. I'm quite good friends with a musician called Shane Carter. He said, what are you doing this weekend? I said, I'm going to Blenheim for the literary festival, the books festival. And he said, New Zealand's best books festival. There you go.
How much do you encourage people to write about what they know rather than pure fiction in creative writing?
I think for people that are beginning to write fiction, it's an easier way in to writing fiction if you base your stories on things you know. I mean, at a pure energy level, you don't have to go off and do a lot of research. But, it's the old adage, write what you know or write what you don't know. And, I knew this world. I've never had the experience of having to go to Australia. This is not me. But I knew this world intimately because I grew up during that period. My next project, which I've just started really, is a whole world that I don't know, but I'm intrigued by. And so that's going to take a whole lot more work before I can actually really get up and planing with that writing.
Now, you teach creative writing in women's prisons.
A men's prison.
How does that start? How did that come about?
There's a charitable trust in Wellington called Right Where You Are, and it has been operating, I think, now for about 6 years in Rimataka Men's Prison and Arahata Women's Prison, and I teach with another fabulous writer, William Brandt, and I teach in the men's prison. So the kind of thinking behind that is bringing creative writing to people who have limited access to it. I established a similar program when I lived in Auckland at Women's Refuge, and I taught in Women's Refuge creative writing in one of the safe houses for about 4 years. And then when I came to Wellington 4 years ago, the Right Where You Are seemed like a natural fit for the work I was doing. So I joined the prison team.
I'm just thinking that for people, this write what you know, this could be quite cathartic for prisoners. It could be the first time that they ever actually talk to anyone or express what actually happened and put them behind bars.
Yeah. Well, the unit we teach in is a very successful therapy unit, and it's for men who have committed very violent crimes, and it's wall-to-wall therapy. Their days look like wall-to-wall therapy. They're in the unit just before they're eligible for parole. It's a very sought after to get a bed in that unit, and but we are not therapists. And we have no other staff in the room when we teach. Is it a bit scary as a woman being in there? No, I don't.
You know that have created violent deeds.
No, I'm not frightened by it at all. It's the room self-regulates, because if there's any problem, then the course would just be closed down immediately. And these men are in there, and it's an opt-in thing. They don't have to do it. And they come in, and you're quite right, they start to write about their lives. And they're not in the room with anybody who's taking notes on their behaviour or what they're saying or anything. And for a lot of men, this is the first time anybody has actually just kind of said, "You're a great writer, let's get on with it." So,
are the stories all about innocence?
The stories are about all sorts of things. Yeah. They've been inside for a long time because of the nature of their crimes. So they imagine a world outside the prison walls, and it's poignant, it's heartbreaking, and it's hopeful. Yeah.
I see a journal in there, a book to be written with those stories.
Yeah. We do publish their stories at the end of each course, but it's only for the men and for the unit. They can't go out into the outside world, which is a shame.
But, it is a shame. Could that change?
No, I don't think so. It's a condition of us being allowed to be in there.
What about the women's prison at Ahata?
To be honest, I have not. I've only done one or two one-off sessions there. I feel, strangely enough, I feel far more comfortable in a men's prison than when, you know, if you're a woman writer and you go into a woman's prison, the kind of the vibe in the room can be a little bit different. Whereas the men, it's very, very clearly a atmosphere of respect for me. So too much to lose.
Yeah, and also you've taken the time, somebody's taken an interest in them.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
Do you, with your creative writing courses, do you ever sort of view them and think, oh, I've got a Catherine Mansfield here?
Yeah.
Have you actually seen that?
I often, yeah. Everybody, the courses I teach are often the entry-level students who take my course, which is a Year 2 university course, are often got their eye on the master's course, the famous Bill Manhire master's course, and then there's a PhD offered after that as well. So this is often their first foray into writing fiction, and everybody arrives in a room feeling nervous, and it's a workshop, so you know it's critiquing each other's work from
that must be so hard. To be in that same situation where everybody's critiquing your work.
Well, everyone's on a level playing field, so you know.
Did you ever offer up any of your work to be critiqued while you were writing loop tracks?
No, I never put my own work in front of them.
That would be terrifying, wouldn't
it? Yeah.
What would they say? Yeah. I mean, you must critique your own work. Do you do it in the same way you'd critique your students?
Yes, same rules. Good writing is good writing, you know.
So what are those rules, basically? We all want to be creative writers.
All right. Pens out, everybody. Show, don't tell is the big one. You know, show us the scene, show us the emotion, don't tell us about it. I mean, that's a pretty golden rule, and if you start writing with that in mind, then...
Show, don't tell.
Yeah.
How different is it to journalism? I mean, in journalism, you write a story, your first paragraph has to give you the meat of it.
Yeah.
And then
the opt-out inverted pyramid, I remember it. Yeah.
Is it the same with fiction?
Well,
I mean, you set the scene so beautifully in this in 1978 that you just want to find out what happens with Charlie.
Yeah.
And then, that drags you in beautifully, like a first paragraph should. The first chapter, I wonder, is that what...
Yeah, I mean, I always start writing a fiction piece by just writing a scene, and a scene that you can imagine yourself in as one of the characters, or sitting on the shoulder of a character and watching what's going on. I guess it's the same premise, you're right. You know, grab your reader, lock them in so they don't want to put the book down, just as you would do with a good newspaper article.
Now, you've written 2 books of short stories and another novel before this. What do you prefer, short stories or the longer fiction?
Apples and pears, really. 2 completely different experiences as a writer. I feel, even though I teach short fiction, I think it's harder to write short fiction than a novel. I think it's the American writer Laurie Moore, who's written both, says a short story is a affair and a novel is a marriage, and it does feel like that. You know, short story, in, out, exciting. Every word has to earn its place on the page, and this is something I am always talking to my students about. What are these adverbs doing here? You know, get rid of them. You've shown us this already. We don't need you then to describe it again for us. Whereas you lock in with a novel, and you have to be sure you're going to be able to go the distance with it. Well, that there's something at the heart of it, this pulsing energy that's going to see you through 300 pages.
Well, I think that's what so interesting when you said it's the journey, not the destination, that you haven't planned out. Yeah. This is how I want it to end.
Yeah. I never know. I never know what's going to happen to these characters, but
that terrifies me, the thought of that.
Oh, well, that's exciting for me. Yeah. See, if I'd known what was going to happen after Charlie got off the plane, I wouldn't have bothered writing the book, because I knew already.
And you had nothing to give.
Yeah, well, I had nothing to discover.
So writing is discovery for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And thankfully COVID came along and gave you part of the journey.
Yeah.
So this next one that you're working on, tell us a little bit about that. It's got a lot of work in it.
I can't say too much about it because it's like really early days and I am still doing the research. I will say that it involves a community that I'm very close to but I'm not a part of. How mysterious, but I'm not going to say anything more than that. And it involves a secret language that I've discovered existed in this country.
That's interesting
at a certain time.
Charlie's quite involved with language in this because she has something I've never had. She gets lost for words.
Yeah.
And so that comes up in here.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the opposite of stuttering.
Yes.
And it is actually
It's a condition.
Yeah.
And I had to do a lot of research around that as well.
I have to find that one and see if I can discover how to get it.
And I consulted a couple of linguistic experts on it as well, again, to make sure I wasn't making a complete fool of myself in the book, in my interpretation.
So linguistics are obviously something you're quite interested in. Secret language.
Yes, yeah, I am. I'm intrigued. You know, as a kid, I loved codes and, you know, invisible ink and, you know.
You could be the next Dan Brown. You realise that, don't you?
Oh dear.
Well, secret codes of invisible ink, you know.
Yeah.
No, I'd like to ask, how did you start writing? I mean, why did you give up journalism for writing?
It was purely practical. My last full-time journalism job was at the Evening Post, and I think it's Bev here, yes, I worked with Bev Dole back in the day. We met each other again the other night. Evening Post, and my husband got a job in France, and off we went to France, and that was in 92. We headed to France and lived there, and I had twins while I was in France, and then arrived back in New Zealand in 95, pregnant with our third child, and I actually wanted to go back to the Evening Post, but I just realised that it was an evening paper. You had to be at work by 6:37 in the morning, and it was just not practical for somebody who had 2-year-old twins and another baby on the way. So,
and I imagine it would have been quite difficult with your husband being in such a high-profile position to be a journalist, you know.
Yeah, he wasn't in a high-profile position back in those days, but yeah. So I came back, and I'd always had this. I set myself up as a freelance contract writer. I was very busy with that work, but I'd always had this hankering to write fiction.
They say every journalist has a book in them.
Yeah. So I actually, my first foray into fiction was as a student of the course that I now teach. That was my first. And William Brandt, who still teaches it, we teach it, we share the year between us. He was my first fiction teacher.
What a huge honour to have gone to that course and now to be teaching it.
Yeah, it's funny. I sat in the room for the first time teaching it, and I thought, you know, it's a big loop. A loop has occurred.
I wanted to ask about that. Where does the title come from? Does it come from Susie's music that is loop track, or is it because of Tommy liking everything to be intact, or because it almost comes full circle in a loop with Jenna, who Charlie thinks might be pregnant and who wants to help her to ensure...
It came from all of those places. I mean, I would never write a book. I don't think writers generally think about themes when they write books. They write the story and the readers see the themes, but at a certain point, I had to introduce Tommy to the real world. So Tommy's lived a very closeted life with his grandmother until his first girlfriend comes along, first year at uni, and she wants to bust him out into the outside world. And I remember sitting there one day thinking, how am I going to get Tommy into the world? And so Jenna takes him to a gig in Wellington, and it's a loop music artist. And how that works is it's one person, but they record. They've got a machine. It's called a loop machine, and they record one series or one round of music. I don't know the right words to describe this, but they record it and then they layer something else over the top of it, and this goes on and on and on until it sounds like you've got a whole band behind you and it's just you. It's still just one person. And I thought, that's how Tommy enters the world, because he would never have been able to walk into a noisy bar and have a band blaring at him. He wouldn't have coped with that, but he's actually watching the looping and he can cope with it because he's understanding the mathematics of music that's going on as well, and that's his entry point into the adult world with this lovely young woman who's looking after him. And the loop artist in the book is actually Jenna, the girlfriend's older sister, Susie. So that's where I got my title from, Loop Tracks. And it's funny, once you have a title and you have this, you do start to see in the work yourself. You see the.
Do you write to a title, or does the title come from the writing?
It just comes halfway through. Yeah.
And you chose that? You didn't?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I wondered whether the publisher says no. It's
Yeah. Well, they've got to approve it, but we agreed on it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was easy. Yeah.
Right, has anybody got any questions for Sue while we're here? We do have a microphone, and I ask, please, if you would use it, because this is being recorded for a podcast, so we just don't want the answers to appear on the podcast with an empty space in between. They'll think that I finally got that disease, whatever it is, and lost my will to speak.
Is this working?
Yes, it is.
I thought your book was wonderful, but I did find it very confronting.
Yeah.
I searched for my firstborn son when he was nearly 50, having been to the movie of Philomena.
Yes.
And it took quite a while, but it worked out very, very successfully.
I'm pleased.
But I have to say that if I had read your book at that stage, I think I wouldn't have looked.
Right.
And my question to you is, did you base Charlie's son's character on the work you did in prisons?
No, I didn't. I would never actually use the experience of anybody I've met in prison in that way. It would not feel morally right for me to do that. But I did need him to be. I did need a character in there to upset the kind of predictable, sometimes predictable, joyful reunion of mother and son, because it doesn't always work out like that. And I must say I'm so pleased that it's worked out for you, but it doesn't always work out like that. And we have a man in the world who's got his own life. He's had his own life, lots of problems. He's a unlikable character. There's not much to like about him. But he's a foil. He's a foil in the book to all the goodness.
You always have to have a baddie.
Yeah.
To sort of even out the goodness.
Yeah.
Goodies.
And there's so much we don't know about his life. And people have asked me if I would write a sequel to the book about him, and it's something that's sitting in the back of my mind to explore what's happened to him in life, because we know so little. I know so little about him. I don't know anything about him.
You haven't been on his journey yet.
I haven't been on his journey yet, but
so
he continues to interest me. Yeah.
What we're actually talking about is the son that Charlie has comes back into her life later on, and obviously Tommy, the grandson, is his actual son, and he's been dumped on Charlie at the age of 4 by his father, and then his father comes back into the book during COVID. So, and it is quite confronting, and it's interesting you bring up it's not always picture perfect. Yesterday I talked to Ruth Shaw, and she was talking about meeting up with her son who was adopted out, and her husband Lance said it was picture perfect. There were these two people, each looked at each other, burst in big smiles, burst into tears and hugged, ran to each other and hugged. And he said, it's exactly as you imagined it would happen, but it can't always be like that.
It can't always be like that.
No. It is, I must say, there are quite a lot, thank you for that question, there are quite a lot of confronting issues in here. Well, there is that, there's alcoholism, there's addiction, there's a whole lot of issues in here that are quite confronting. Was it confronting to write?
Yeah, it was, And I always just let the characters develop and let them head off on their way, and I sit on their shoulders and see where they're going. And, some people have said to me, oh, how did you manage to plan all these issues into the book? And I said, I plan nothing. I sit on the shoulders of ordinary, flawed human beings and see what comes their way.
I think that must be the beauty about the journey, not the destination.
Yeah. And so writing it, nothing felt forced about it. It was just, this person's got this problem to deal with, and this one over here, and this problem over here. Oh, and it's COVID. Well, how's she going to muddle along? How did we all muddle along? Well, we just did, and they just do, and not with great outcomes always, because that's life, but we muddle along.
Would this book have occurred if COVID hadn't?
Yes, it would have, yeah. It would obviously be an entirely different book, but I still would have had my characters played out against,
a different
the run up to the general election and the abortion law reform, which actually only went through last year. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Kirsten.
Oh, kia ora and ngā mihi nui for your fabulous books, Sue. I so enjoyed it. And I hope that the question I'm going to ask isn't too confronting or political, but I'm really curious about Roe v. Wade and the current situation sort of playing out in the US, and what your take in is if you were to write the book now, what would it look like, and how would it be the same or different to 2 years ago?
Oh, that's a great question. I wonder if I could have another crack at writing a version 2. Well, I think, firstly, Roe versus Wade reminds us all how fragile legislation is, and how political will can turn and gain a momentum that is terrifying for a lot of people. Nothing is set in stone. And, at a political level here in New Zealand, I can't imagine that happening, but,
can't take it for granted.
You can't take anything for granted. And this is the really interesting thing about, the protest movement, anti-abortion movement in New Zealand. It's always there. It's all, and I suppose it's just about being vigilant at a personal level, at a political level, at a social level, about the winds of change and being aware of a change.
I wonder what Dame Margaret Sparrow would think now.
About Roe versus Wade.
Yes.
Well, I saw her interviewed on TV a couple of weeks ago, and I think she kind of echoed that idea about, nothing's set in stone.
Be vigilant, it could happen here. How interesting. I wonder if, when you talked about following Jim up, I mean, if you did that, would you start the book the same, or would you have to change it?
I would have to have a big think about both of those things. I mean, I wouldn't...
I like the idea of it, though.
Yeah, I do too. And
we
if
could
I
have sowed a seed here.
Yeah.
And then when you win great awards for your second novel, you can say it all came from the Marlborough Book Festival.
Kirsten McDougall, who's on after me, and please stay for her session, because she's a killer. It's a fabulous book. Kirsten and I did a wee book event in Wellington recently, and it was attended by a book club, members of a book club, and they actually wrote the sequel for Loot Tracks. And they decided it was going to be set in Palmerston North. So we've already got our setting sorted.
And how did it go? I was born in Palmerston. I mean, I grew up in Palmerston North.
Oh, look,
it would have to be bad if it was set in Palmerston North. Sort of
well, I hate to say, but that was their view as well.
Oh, right. There's a reason I am as I am, Ross. Palmerston North. It's all there. What did they write? I mean, can you tell us?
Oh, no, they didn't write. It was just a forum much like this, actually, where it just, the idea for the sequel kind of got up and running.
Oh, no, I like it more that it came from the Marlborough Book Festival.
Okay, we'll stick with that.
So you've only actually done a couple of things on your book and it must be gutting to actually work that hard on a book. It was released last year, but of course festivals were cancelled all over the country. Yeah. And so you haven't actually been able to get out and promote it. Interesting, the book festival that you have done was in Adelaide.
Yeah.
So it's a very New Zealand book in the sense of numbers and the election and everything else. Yeah. How did it go down in Australia?
It went really well, and it's interesting that, New Zealand women were travelling to Australia, but, the different states in Australia had different rules and regulations as well. So the book was published by an Australia publisher in March, and was so fortunate to be able to go to Adelaide Writers Festival, and the book was kind of launched there at that time. I met the publisher for the first time. She was from Perth. And what happened afterwards, when people were coming up to talk to me, they'd come from all around Australia and talked about, it's the same stigma. There was the same stigma there. The laws and regulations were different and easier to perhaps procure a legal abortion mostly. But, the shame and the stigma is universal. Mm. Yeah. So, the feeling I came away with was that it's a universal story. And, of course, Ireland, they were only a year or so ahead of us in changing abortion law there.
That actually was the first thing I thought when I read this.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, my God, all the books I've read about Ireland and having to go to England.
Go to England, yeah.
And I hadn't realised that this was happening in my era, here in New Zealand.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you go about getting published overseas, like you did with this? I mean, are there more other countries that this is likely to come out in?
Well, that would be wonderful.
Well, it is a universal story, as you say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what happened for me was I published here, and I got an agent who is actually Australian, but he lives in Germany, and he took the book on, and because his history was as a bookseller originally in Australia, so all his contacts are mostly there. And he sent it out to several publishers that he thought might be interested in, and I was very fortunate. The first person who read it came back and said, yes, I want this book. So it went off the market at that point. So I don't know how, if there would have been more interest or not, because once she said yes, we
Wow,
said
what elation. How did you feel when he told you that?
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it, yeah. And now, now it's being kind of sent out to publishers in the US. Of course, Roe versus Wade, the terrible thing that it is, has been, it's helped my book get it in front of publishers. And also England. So I have no expectations. I've never had any expectations outside New Zealand for the book. I felt it was such a New Zealand story. So anything that's happened over and above the wonderful treatment it's had from Te Herenga Waka University Press, which is the former VUP, I've been so well treated by them that anything is a bonus over and above that.
Are you good at selling your book? I mean, Ruth Shaw was saying that she couldn't sell her book if she tried. It's up to her husband to go around and say, oh, see, my wife wrote this and you better buy it. Yeah. I mean, do you have somebody doing that for you?
Well, that is the job of the publisher, really.
Right.
And
I reckon it must be hard to sell yourself.
Oh, yeah, no, not my thing at all. I mean, my kids go into bookshops and make sure there are 10 copies of it across the shelf. Yeah, and I say, well, that's really obvious. You could just do a couple, maybe, but yeah, no.
They must be so proud of you, though.
Yeah, they are. I think they are.
They want to see your name up there. Yeah. So everybody, you have to buy it for her sons, for no other reason. So is there any other questions? So we've got a couple of minutes left before the session ends, and Kirsten makes her way up here for her session. No? Oh, yep. Yes. Thanks, Duncan. Just wait, the microphone's on its way.
Hi, Sue.
Hi.
Actually, I think you're going to come to my book club soon. So, but I'm just interested in how you develop characters. Like, how do you find those characters and how do you create them? And then do you... I mean, you mentioned that you know people, but then you're actually shaping them in a different way.
Yeah.
And then how do you do that? And then do you like them?
Yeah. Really good question. So I think every writer starts in a different way. I know writers who start with a landscape. Kirsty Gunn, New Zealand writer who lives in England or possibly even Scotland, I'm not quite sure. Apparently she starts with literally a landscape. Imagine looking out here and thinking, who lives here? What do they do? But the landscape is so strong, it's the kicking off point that the landscape is almost a character in the book. Me, not so much. So for me, and I've been thinking a lot about this because I'm just starting to think about a new work. So what are the catalysts? There are two things. somebody tells me that I just go, oh my God, I've got to write about that. And it'll be a weird little thing. So for this book, it was not, I had to go to Australia for an abortion. It was the plane was delayed. And I just went, oh God. I would have loved to have written the whole book in the 6 hours, but I'm not that good a writer. I couldn't do that. So that was the tingle. And then I think, well, who are the people? Okay, who's my character and what's she going to do? And then I just start thinking, they're purely fictional, they really are. Of course, you draw on everything you know about people. But so I don't start writing. The thing I've learned 4 books on is don't start writing until you've got a really good sense of who this person is.
Your main character.
Yeah, main character. And then the others will fall into place around them. But and I'm not saying, profile, 16-year-old girl. It's deeper than that. It's an understanding or a suspicion of their fears and their flaws and their unpredictability. And then I start, and I am literally in the head of that person. That person, I inhabit that character.
So is it hard to let them go?
I have never let any of them go.
So you're still living them?
I'm still living these ones. Yeah. The most recent work, I dream about them. Yeah. They're real people. Yeah, I can visualise them.
Become part of your life.
Yeah.
I can imagine that.
Yeah. So that's, characters. And the times that I've started writing without locking, it feels like a locking in to a personality, then I've faltered. So that's what I've learnt, after 2 books of short stories and 2 novels. Don't start until you've got a sense of the energy of that person, what that feels like, and then rely on them. Because the bonus of waiting is then you don't actually have to think up anything. They're doing it. They're driving the book. They're driving the book forward. And sometimes I'm writing and I think, oh God, what do they do that for? That's not a good idea, but they've done it, so on we go,
Almost like being voyeuristic.
It is, yeah.
Looking in over someone's shoulder.
And that's the alchemy. For me, that's the reason I write fiction, is those surprises. When I'm typing away and I thought, oh, God, that's a curveball.
She wouldn't really sleep with that man,
She wouldn't have read... Yeah, and yet.
And she threw out her
polar fleece.
Polar fleeces.
Yeah.
No one would do that. Not a Marlborough. We all need our polar fleeces.
Yeah. So that's the answer.
Any other questions? We'll wrap it up then. Well, Sue, thank you, and thank you for your honesty and your great advice. Actually, it's a great book. It is. You said earlier, it is for sale out in the foyer. Sue will sign. Please just wear a mask if you're going up, and actually, please wear a mask out there when you're buying all that wine with 10% off.
My last bit of advice: if it's low alcohol wine that they're serving, you probably have to have double what you thought you might want this morning. So have another glass, maybe.
What happens with no alcohol? Oh. Don't drink it. Okay. Right. So thank you very much, Sue, and thank you very much to you, Tessa. The audience.
That was Sue Orr speaking to Tessa Nicholson at the 2022 Marlborough Book Festival. A big thanks to all the writers that have supported the festival, as well as the audiences that attended in person or listened online. If you'd like to learn more about the event, head over to marlboroughbookfest.co.nz. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe and tell a friend. Thanks for listening.